So good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you for the nice words of presentation, and also thank you to IHC for the kind invitation. Who I am, as it was said, I am Costa Rican. I am a lawyer. I'm a person with a spina bifida. I am, most of all, or through my journey, what I've been doing is advocating for the rights of persons with disabilities in many capacities. As a DPO member in Costa Rica, then as a regional DPO member or representative as well, and then in the international level. And then I started to advocate for the rights of persons with disabilities within the international institutions, and from there work with governments, with organizations of persons with disabilities, but also with all the different stakeholders in the international system. We are not UN staff, although we have the UN before our title. We're just independent experts that are designated by the human rights system in Geneva to monitor particular rights. So we have different rapporteurs monitoring different areas: torture, housing, water and sanitation, indigenous peoples. And what we do is we try to advance the rights of, in my case, people with disabilities or disabled people. And I have to do the disclaimer that I don't have a preference for either terminology, disabled people of persons with disabilities, but I will use persons with disabilities because that's the terminology that is used in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I do monitoring, but I also do, I do also support states to advance in how to implement the rights of persons with disabilities. One of my main tasks is to provide technical assistance to states. And why is that? Because after the adoption of the convention, and you, I hope, are very familiar with the convention, states were like a little bit clueless. Okay, now what do? We have this innovative treaty that is putting a lot of obligations. We have this paradigm shift, and we have to work in all these new ways of seeing the rights of persons with disabilities, but sometimes we don't know how to do it. And so the system is trying to create different pieces to support the work of the states. And the special rapporteur is one of those pieces. And how do I do that? I provide technical assistance, for instance, when I produce reports. I have to present 2 thematic reports a year, one to the Human Rights Council and one to the UN General Assembly. And in those reports, I try to pick areas, thematic areas, that will impact in the way in which countries are implementing the rights of persons with disabilities. I have also established for my work, and as it was mentioned, this is the first time that we have a special rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities. So I am the first one with this mandate, and for that reason, I also had a tremendous challenge in setting the structure of the mandate. So how is the mandate going to look like? And I decided to put some focus and some priorities to my work. The first focus or thematic cluster, I will say, is poverty reduction. We all know how poverty affects persons with disabilities around the world. And we all know that unless we tackle poverty issues, we are not going to be able to move ahead in our quest to improve the quality of life and rights and enjoyment of people with disabilities. Then I have another thematic area which is also very related to it, and I think that it's needless to say when we are talking about human rights, and all that I will try to say to you is trying to focus on the human rights-based approach to disability. When we are talking about human rights, everything is interrelated. If we are talking about development, if we're talking about participation, if we're talking about legal capacity, everything is related. We cannot enjoy one without the other. So my thematic area is building citizenship. How do we contribute? How do we make states to recognize the legal existence of persons with disabilities and the right to participate as equal members of society? And that touches on legal capacity, so the full recognition of persons with disabilities' existence, and the eradication of representatives, of representation, like in formats of guardians or tutors of other kind of representatives, instead by providing support. How do we enhance the participation, the political participation? How do we support that? And how do we change our mindsets regarding the area of political participation of persons with disabilities. The third area is what I call embracing diversity, and I think it has been brought here several times. So how do we raise awareness on the fact that disability and persons with disabilities are part of human diversity? Disability is a normal part of life, and we have to embrace it, and we have to just celebrate the fact that we have persons with disabilities in our communities and just go our lives with it, embracing that human diversity. And that is another big part of my work, because if we don't change that perception of persons with disabilities as somehow being less worth, and even though most of the times in the international discourse you will never hear that mentioned, and I'm struggling with the language. Spanish is my first language, so please bear with me here. We need to try to change that perception in order to advance. And even though people is not saying that they have stereotypes and that stigma is all around persons with disabilities, we don't say that anymore publicly. Deep inside many of our brains and minds, we still have that notions of disability being a negative thing. So we really need to work towards building the identity and the pride of persons with disabilities, and that is an important part of my work. I also do, and that it's important, and I'll finish with that, the part of what I do and what are special rapporteurs. I have the opportunity to do country visits, and that also builds in my role as providing technical assistance to states. When I do country visits, I'm in a country for 10 days, and I have the okay of the government to meet with all the relevant authorities to make a complete assessment of what is the situation of persons with disabilities in a particular country. And after that, I'm able to make concrete recommendations on what are the main areas in which the country has the most significant challenges when it comes to advancing the rights of persons with disabilities. And then try to provide, of course, guidance on how to address those challenges. So in that context, and then I also have the opportunity, as you can imagine, to meet with a lot of relevant stakeholders, from civil society to governments to UN agencies, and try to understand what are their needs. I'm also trying to connect the dots, and I'm also trying to listen in from each community and see, oh, this community has this problem, this community has this solution. How do we come across? How do we put them together? How do we try to find solutions together as well? Because many times we are very good in identifying the problems, but we are less good in identifying the solutions and identifying the solutions together. What I would like to share with you today is that, well, of course, I would like to build this conversation around human rights. You are, all of you, probably experts on the field of employment and persons with disabilities, and you know very well what are all the challenges that you face on a daily basis to promote the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the labor market. But I would like to think with you and to try to map what are the structural challenges that we are facing to achieve that inclusion. I would like just to do that exercise with you, to try to see not only the final part, but where is that the problems are being set up? What are the structural reasons why we are not able to get that inclusion of persons with disabilities? So what I'm going to say is not new to you, I'm pretty sure. You will be nodding, you will be at some points bored, perhaps, with what I'm going to say. You will say this is common sense. However, it's very surprising that when I'm talking outside the disability community, a lot of people look at me like, oh, this is a total revelation. We never thought about that. Oh, really? Is that true? And I think that we really need to be able to do this exercise of mapping those causes and to communicate those causes better to the outside world in order to make changes. And sometimes that is a challenge, because what they say outside, and I'm sorry if I do this outside-inside thing, But what I have encountered is that there is no evidence that persons with disabilities are poorer than the rest of the community. I'm like, what do you mean there's no evidence? And you come across that kind of argument, there's no evidence. No, is there a link, really, between disability and poverty? Can you prove that? And so we really need to make the connection with the hard evidence we have, and we also need to build more evidence to get our arguments across. So today, I would like to focus on 3 points, and if I manage to understand this, which will be the issues for discussion. The first one is inequality. The second one is the cost of exclusion. The third one will be the key role of social protection in advancing the rights of persons with disabilities. Then I would like to discuss about the need for disability-inclusive responses and policies, and then about the need to have meaningful consultation, engagement, and participation of persons with disabilities. And I'm not going to have an extensive PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to have this so that you remind that we're going to be discussing about these issues in case you get lost. So the first one is inequalities, and how inequalities impact or permeate the lives of persons with disabilities. Of course, we all know that persons with disabilities are absent from the public debates and from the public agendas, and that it's the same at national and international level. And of course, I'm going to try to focus at international level because this is what I'm seeing. But of course, until very recently, for instance, it took the human rights system and the UN more than 60 years to recognize that persons with disabilities were not actually covered by the treaty system. So after 60 years, they decided to adopt the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but it took them 60 years. It took them more than that. Only last year, for the first time, persons with disabilities were included in the International Development Agenda. So we had several instruments in the past, international instruments and tools to promote development for all, inclusion, inclusive development. However, persons with disabilities were not mentioned. We had that with the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, in where persons with disabilities were not mentioned. And that has been recognized as being one of the reasons why the Millennium Development Goals were not achieved. So we are absent of the discussions, and we're visible most of the times. We have been treated as recipients of care, charity, paternalism, rather as rights holders. It is true that we're witnessing tremendous change with the adoption of the convention and with the paradigm shift that the convention brings. We're seeing a lot of changes, a lot of new energy, but we're still far ahead from our goals. We recognize, at least at international level, and moving into the national level more and more, we are recognized as human rights holders and, of course, as central part of the development agenda. So why is that we should be talking about inequalities and perhaps thinking about Phil? I don't want to start only with the bad things, but I think that just as a reminder of the challenges that we face, of course, we have to discuss about inequalities because this is a matter of social justice. We cannot be talking about at international level of leaving no one behind, that is the slogan, as you know, of the new Sustainable Development Agenda, while worldwide persons with disabilities are the poorest of the poor. And while we are always left behind, and we are not going to change that until we start paying attention to the limited opportunities and the multiple discrimination and stigma that persons with disabilities face, their exclusion from schools. So we all know how difficult it is to get kids with disabilities to school, especially those with particular kinds of impairments, such as persons with learning disabilities, autistic children. We are also excluded from the labor market. We have lower salaries, even sometimes below the minimum wage. And I just learned in New Zealand you have a legislation that allows to exempt the minimum so that you are allowed to pay persons with disabilities sometimes below the minimum wage, and that it's an issue worldwide. We are also overrepresented as victims of violence, domestic violence, sexual abuse, forced sterilization, and of course this is particularly relevant for women with disabilities. It doesn't matter if you live in a rich or in a poor country, persons with disabilities will always be overrepresented under the poverty lines, and that is important. So we are not talking about a south-north issue, we're talking about a systematic issue in which persons with disabilities are always under the line of poverty of most of them. We are not going to tackle the exclusion of persons with disabilities unless we are able to recognize the additional costs of living with a disability. The disability-related costs have a tremendous impact on the lives and the participation of persons with disabilities, and we need to start talking about that more and more. We need to talk about the intersections between the different identities of persons with disabilities. We have women, we have indigenous women, we have persons with different types of impairment, we have people that have different races, and unless we touch on those interactions, we are not going to be able to provide a comprehensive and complete response to the needs of inclusion of persons with disabilities. As you know, our participation is also challenged on a daily basis by environmental barriers. We have, of course, the physical barriers to access any kind of building, but also to access information and communication. We have the attitudinal barriers, of course, that lead to discrimination, and I said they are rooted in the misconceptions and perceptions about the lives and the value of the lives of persons with disabilities. But we also have, and I want to focus a lot on this today, the institutional barriers. We have barriers that come in the form, for instance, of policy design, program design, that supposedly are neutral to persons with disabilities or even inclusive of persons with disabilities, but without taking into consideration all these other aspects of the costs, the multiple identities of persons with disabilities, their high rates of poverty, their levels of inclusion, it's going to be very hard that we have institutional policies that are not creating further barriers to the participation of persons with disabilities, or that at least are not considering their needs to be able to provide solutions. Of course, that all these barriers result in further exclusion of persons with disabilities, and those barriers deepen the levels of inequality that we face. That is within countries, that is also among the different groups and sectors, and here also I've learned, and you will know in each of your countries, each of your communities might have groups of the disability community that are more disadvantaged than others. So for instance, we know that deaf people, hard of hearing people, deaf-blind people, autistic people, people with learning disabilities, or psychosocial disabilities face additional challenges to access essential services, healthcare, education, or justice. So we have that, and we say, well, we cannot leave. You cannot leave us behind. We have the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, both saying that we should include persons with disabilities, both sending clear messages about we cannot do it, this is a matter of social justice, this is a matter of development. However, sometimes those arguments are not enough, and we are not able to convince our Ministry of Finance of why it's important to include persons with disabilities. And it's quite significant that we don't have the government here, because what I think that we should be doing here is thinking about the strategies of getting our governments online with what we do. I believe that a lot of you are organizations that are advocating for the inclusion and participation of persons with disabilities, and most of you have to deal on a daily basis with the government. So how do we make a strategy, or how do we build our arguments to have these conversations with the government in a way that will allow us to let them know what they have to do to address the structural challenges that are faced by persons with disabilities and that need governmental intervention. I was thinking when Phil was speaking about this issue of skills. We need persons with disabilities to have skills, and we need to shape those skills. And it is true. And to have that, we really need the government to create a system which will allow persons with disabilities to access those basic opportunities that will allow us to then go and show our talents in the labor market. But for that, we need to advocate with the government so that they do their part of the work. We are all trying to do our part of the work here, but they do have to do their part of the work. And we have to have a clear understanding of what is the part of the work that the government has to do. What are those policies that we need in place so that we can build upon those policies and reach our final goal. So one of the key arguments that we are trying to use to convince the Ministry of Finance is that if they don't want to listen to the social justice or human rights arguments, they will have to start listening to the cost of exclusion argument. Because more and more we have evidence that allow us to interact with the government and say, hey, if you don't include persons with disabilities, you're not only not going to reach development for persons with disabilities, but for the rest of the community, right? So it's important to remember that poverty and exclusion of persons with disabilities affect us all as a society, not only persons with disabilities. When we face barriers to participation, when we are less able to work and thus we are less able to contribute economically to our communities, we are impacting the overall well-being of our communities. A study of the International Labour Organization, the ILO, estimated that the cost of excluding persons with disabilities could amount to 1 to 7% of a country's gross domestic product. So the cost of exclusion is significant not only for persons with disabilities, as I said, and their families, of course, but also for the country's economy. Actually, this number, which is quite high, might even be underestimated because this estimation didn't consider the impact on family members who are responsible to support the relatives with disabilities. They also didn't take into account the potential contributions of persons with disabilities or how much could persons with disabilities have been contributing to if they were working. So we have a big issue here. In general, societies cannot afford to have 15% of their population outside the labor market. It's simply not sustainable. It will not work anymore. When we face these higher levels of unemployment, of temporary work, or being just part of the informal economy, we have all the community affected. And of course, we are now developing the tools and the economic arguments to say that actually the exclusion of persons with disabilities is far more costly than their inclusion. Its inclusion is a more effective and efficient way of dealing with things than exclusion. So in this context, we have a great opportunity with the new development agenda, as I mentioned, that should be guided by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we need to use these arguments to say, well, look, you have to look at investing in persons with disabilities and their inclusion. And you have to reflect on how much it's going to cost us as a community to exclude them, and of course, the overall damage that it will cost. So what's the way forward? And perhaps I forgot my PowerPoint. Very good. So it seems I'm in the PowerPoint and the party against PowerPoint presentations. I keep forgetting about them. But the way forward, and I want to focus on one issue that I think it's very important, and I am going to be known as the social protection special rapporteur probably because I talk a lot about social protection. I do believe that without social protection and without comprehensive social protection systems that are disability inclusive, it's very hard for any country to achieve disability inclusion and participation. I studied, and I have a first report. My first report was on social protection, on disability inclusive social protection, and the first barrier I had was the disability community. They all looked at me, the DPOs, like, why is that you are going to start talking about social protection? You are a human rights expert. You shouldn't be talking about welfare. You shouldn't be talking about paternalistic things. And I was like, okay, we have to really understand that we are not talking about a charity approach or a welfare approach. We're talking about social protection for participation. And if you don't have your basic needs covered, it's going to be very hard that you're going to be outside advocating for your rights to participate in political life if you're struggling to go day by day and have your basic needs met. So that's why I started the work on social protection. And I think that social protection is also, as we will see, a way to promote the inclusion in the labor market. Both the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the new Sustainable Development Agenda, what we call the 2030 Agenda, have highlighted the importance of social protection system for achieving social inclusion and active participation of persons with disabilities. As you all know, social protection is essential. It's an essential condition for social economic development for all. So this is not something that is only relevant for persons with disabilities. We all have access to social protection, whether we have a disability or not. The only thing is that sometimes we take that for granted. So if we have well-designed social protection systems, they can contribute to building inclusive societies and social cohesion, and will protect individuals from risk and from deprivation. Social protection is perhaps the most powerful instruments for providing income security and reducing poverty and inequality. But also, social protection plays an important role in enhancing human potential. For example, by enabling individuals to access healthcare, education, employment, and financial means. In this regard, and in particular for persons with disabilities, social protection can have a really positive impact. Social protection programs can play a crucial role in alleviating and preventing poverty and vulnerability, for instance, through the poverty reduction strategies. Social protection can also, on the second place, enhance the productivity, the employability, and the economic development of persons with disabilities, and thus will contribute to their income security. For example, social protection programs can help to remove the social barriers or the economic barriers that impede access to employment, and secure access to skill development programs, creating better income earning opportunities for persons with disabilities. And thirdly, and more important, social protection can also constitute a powerful strategy for developing human capacity and promoting full and effective participation. By facilitating access to food, healthcare, and education, as well as support services, social protection actually enhances the independence, the inclusion, and the active participation of persons with disabilities. However, and as I said before, being this great opportunity, we failed to put enough attention to it, and most of social protection systems around the world are not disability inclusive. Most of them might cover some needs of persons with disabilities, but it's very rarely that they're actually being designed from a human rights point of view. So sometimes what we see is that countries are developing systems that are actually furthering the exclusion of persons with disabilities. And I'm going to give you an example of that later on. We are for sure thinking of, and especially in the field of employment, When we face this social protection approach that is medical, sometimes you might have heard about the benefit trap. Have you heard about the benefit trap, right? And that is a problem we have with the social protection system sometimes. So in most countries, when persons with disabilities are granted disability benefits, these benefits are often based in their incapacity to work, right? And this places persons with disabilities in a very awkward situation, because in order to get the benefit, you have to actually declare that you're incapable to work, instead of, I want the benefit to be able to work, and I want the benefit to be able to participate to work. And so we are like in a crossroad where we have to choose between securing some minimum but stable income instead of seeking for enjoyment when we are facing the risk of job insecurity and insufficient income to cover all of our expenses. So disability benefits are fundamental, of course, and we need to have those. We need to have disability benefits to cover the extra cost of living with a disability and to cover for the support services that we might need and accessing employment. But we don't need disability benefits to stay at home. That will contribute, again, to a lack of participation, and that will increase the costs of exclusion of a society. So we have to avoid dealing or facing that kind of benefit trap that push actually persons with disabilities away of the labor market. Under a human rights-based approach, social protection must promote active citizenship, social inclusion, and community participation, avoiding paternalism, dependence, and segregation. This means, in the case of disability benefits, supporting persons with disabilities to find and retain quality employment. Social protection and employment policies should not undermine the rights of persons with disabilities or contribute to their social exclusion. And this seems very basic, but it's very true, and we still see that. We still see that children with disabilities are segregated in special schools or in institutions. We still see that we receive segregated services, specific and special services for persons with disabilities. And when employment policies were implemented, persons with disabilities sometimes are still being sent to shelter workshop instead of to the open labor market. So we really have to fight against that notion that whatever comes as social protection might be segregated or encouraging to leave the mainstream world. So with that said, I think that, and we have to remind that we have the new task of making our work CRPD compliant. So if we look at social protection that is CRPD compliant with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that social protection should actually contribute to enhance the employability of persons with disabilities by providing, for example, work experience and training, opportunities for persons with disabilities to access this training. Also, the employability of persons with disabilities could be increased by designing by designing tailored vocational training, building on their basic education skills. And these programs that can be developed under the social protection should be demand-driven and become integral part of the mainstream education and employment strategies. So we don't want special training packages, but we want packages that are tailored for the needs of persons with disabilities that can be accessed through the regular mainstream vocational training and employment strategies. Productive employment and decent work are the main routes out of poverty, and we all know that. Well-designed social protection programs can address the particular barriers that concerning the access and participation of persons with disabilities in employment. And so I think that as a way forward, we do really need to continue advocating with the governments to make sure that they make their social protection systems inclusive of persons with disabilities, and that when they are giving us money to support the development of social protection strategies, we as organizations are also looking at how good are we doing in delivering and designing the services that we are providing in a way that is complying with the CRPD. Because that is also important. In many countries, we've seen that the government gives resources to many of the organizations so that those organizations provide the services and support that persons with disabilities need. So how do we make sure that from our part, we are also doing the work and using those resources in a transformative way, in a way that is respectful of the rights of persons with disabilities, and at the end, that means in a way that will promote their participation in society on an equal basis with others. So we need to advocate for a systemic or systematic, I never know which one is the correct one, change. We really need to look at the structural barriers that we're facing and the contributions that need to be made from the policy point of view. And I insist a lot, my main goal for my advocacy work is the government. So, but besides that, because okay, we need to know, and I would recommend to look at the report for more detail, what are the steps that we have to consider when redesigning a social protection program. But we also need to think about broader policies, because we also need to have disability inclusive responses overall, and we need to create this change and to be able to really allow persons with disabilities to access employment and to participate in the employment workforce, in the workforce, we really need to create also a systematic change in the whole range of policies that the government has. And why is that? Of course, I think that, and this is going to be part of my next report, we need to really consider how effective and how inclusive are the responses that we're giving to persons with disabilities. And again, how mainstream they are, because I think we are tired of having specific solutions for persons with disabilities instead of considering persons with disabilities through all the scope. And this is important because, as I said, persons with disabilities have multiple identities. So first of all, we have to think when we are advising our policymakers in front of you to further the inclusion of persons with disabilities or to promote the inclusion of persons with disabilities, we have to think about, okay, what are we going to tell them? Are we going to tell them to just do all this stuff? And it's like, oh, you have to go as article by article on the convention. What are the key elements if you're in front of a policymaker that I think should be the key messages that you can send and say, these could be 3 main strategies that you can use to advance the inclusion of persons with disabilities. And I believe those are non-discrimination, accessibility, and the provision of support services and assistive devices. So any country, any government should work on their non-discrimination framework. So from a legal point of view, it is important that in a country there are existing structures that allow persons with disabilities to claim for legal aid in case of discrimination, legal systems that recognize or that prohibit discrimination on the basis of disabilities, and that allow persons with disabilities to enjoy from all the system services and opportunities. Of course, this is not the situation yet, even though in some places we have legislation, we don't have mechanisms in place to make the legislation, to enforce the legislation. And what we know is that persons with disabilities continue to face discrimination. Second important part of the non-discrimination, and very relevant, and when we talk about work for persons with disabilities, is reasonable accommodation. When we're dealing with non-discrimination, we have to make sure that the government has in place a system that recognizes the right of persons with disabilities to have reasonable accommodation, and that the denial of reasonable accommodation, as is stated in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, will be considered discrimination. I thought that I had a lot of time, but I don't have a lot of time. So I might want to rush a little bit here. So we also need to, again, insist on the notion of embracing human diversity. We have to think about accessibility. I'm sorry, when I was talking of embracing diversity, the fact that we need to recognize, and I will insist in this again, the diversity of the disability movement, and how do we need to check on how inclusive are we. It's not good only to include certain groups of persons with disabilities. We don't want wheelchairs to have access to everything. We have every single person with a disability to have access to the services, and that requires a special attention, because otherwise, if we don't make efforts to include persons with disabilities, persons with intellectual disabilities, for instance, and I know that many of you work with persons with intellectual disabilities, then we are not being inclusive. But then the second aspect is that we really need to think about accessibility as a whole. It doesn't matter what we do if the things are not accessible. And accessible meaning access to information, to communication, to the environment. It doesn't matter how many opportunities we have to work if we cannot access transportation, if we cannot access public services. It really is a struggle if we cannot navigate the system in which we live. And we will never get that unless we have standards of accessibility that will allow us to fully participate. And then the third point is the support services. And I think that very little is said about that, even though the convention focuses a lot, on the need to have availability of support services for persons with disabilities. We're thinking here, and this is the only time I'm going to be talking about disability-specific support services. We may get universal design. We might have full accessibility. We might have an ideal society in which everybody will participate, and some persons with disabilities will always require specific support services in order to participate. We're talking about sometimes personal assistance, sometimes about sign language interpreters. Sometimes we're talking about assistive devices, or we're talking about service animals. But people with disabilities might also need all disability-specific support services. And little attention is being paid by the governments to this kind of support that needs to be available for persons with disabilities, because that will complement the notion of reasonable accommodation in many cases, that will also facilitate the participation of persons with disabilities. And we need to advocate for the inclusion of as many of assistance and support services as possible in the existing employment policies and programs. I think that the states should allocate budget, and plan these services when designing their policies and programs. Some disability-specific services, as you know, may be run by civil society organizations, but it is important to ensure that the states have a clear obligation to ensure that those services are provided and that persons with disabilities have information about them and that have access to them. And of course, we have to make sure that these support services are being designed and are facilitating or are enabling the direct choice and control of persons with disabilities of their support services. So the control and support of users over the services provided is fundamental. I want to close because my time is finishing. I still have a minute and a half. But what I think is fundamental, and as an overarching consideration that I cannot say that enough and stress that enough, is the notion of participation. The key element of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and all of the work we are doing in the area of human rights and persons with disabilities, it's around the notion of participation. The well-known nothing about us without us, that I now think that is nothing without us, period. Nothing without persons with disabilities. Everything that is done in a community impacts in the lives of persons with disabilities because we are all around. We need to work in direct consultation with organizations of persons with disabilities. We need to support the capacity building processes of the organizations of persons with disabilities so that we can with them in a better way and also get better input for them in the design. Their participation in their consultation and the processes of design services and the processes of design strategies is fundamental to achieve success. If we don't do this in a participatory manner, whatever we're doing, whatever our part of the puzzle is in this big work, we are not going to be successful. We're trying to do that in the international level. I work on an everyday basis with the International Labor Organization, with the WHO, with UNICEF, and we're trying to bring the voices of persons with disabilities. And I hope that you will do that also in your work, and you will push the government that while doing their tasks, they're also consulting and engaging permanently with the organizations of persons with disabilities. I thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry if I bore you too much.
Thank you.